Imagine waking up in the middle of deep space, light years away from Earth, with no way back. The ship you were born on is the only world you will ever know. This is the terrifying reality of a generation ship. A massive spacecraft designed to carry entire human populations on multi-generational voyages to distant star systems. But what happens when something goes horribly wrong? Science fiction has long explored the psychological and physical horrors of such journeys. Isolation, dwindling resources, and technological failures are just the beginning. What if the ship's original mission is lost over centuries? What if an external threat, like an alien entity, lurks in the darkness of space? And perhaps most terrifying of all, what if the danger doesn't come from the outside but from within? A generation ship is more than just a spacecraft, it's a moving civilization. A world of its own, drifting through the endless void of space. Unlike traditional space missions, which are manned by trained astronauts with a clear goal, a generation ship is home to people who never chose this journey. They were born into it. They will live and die within its metallic corridors, never seeing the planet their ancestors departed from or the one their descendants might someday reach. But what happens when the ship itself becomes a prison? When centuries of isolation twist the minds of its inhabitants, and the mission fades into myth? What happens when something unnatural begins to awaken within the ship's cold, mechanical heart? Life aboard a generation ship was designed to be self-sustaining. Artificial ecosystems regulate oxygen and food production. Technology maintains the ship's trajectory, keeping it on course toward a distant, unknown world. But nothing is truly self-sustaining forever. Over time, systems fail, resources become scarce, knowledge is lost, a once organized society begins to fracture. The earliest generations may have followed strict rules to maintain order. But hundreds of years later, their descendants may no longer remember why those rules existed in the first place. On board the ship Erebus, the people have forgotten their mission. The control room, once a place where engineers monitored the ship's status, is now a forbidden temple, sealed off and surrounded by superstition. The AI that once guided the vessel is now worshipped as a silent god. Its malfunctioning systems generating cryptic messages that the people interpret as prophecy. And then, the disappearances begin. At first, it's just rumors. A maintenance worker goes missing after entering an unlit section of the ship. A child claims to have seen strange movements in the ventilation ducts. The elders dismiss it as fearmongering. But when an entire family vanishes from their quarters without a trace, panic spreads like wildfire. The ship is vast, filled with tunnels, maintenance shafts, and forgotten chambers sealed off generations ago. What if something was waiting inside? What if, in the ship's centuries-long journey, it has picked up a passenger that no one ever noticed? Perhaps it started as a microbial life form, harmless at first, but as it fed on the ship's recycled nutrients, it evolved. It adapted to its metal environment, growing in the shadows where no human eyes could see. And now, after generations of waiting, it's ready to hunt, with no escape, no authorities to turn to, and no way of knowing who will be taken next. The people of Erebus begin to turn on each other. Accusations fly. Some believe the disappearances are the work of a secret cult, performing rituals in the name of the ship's AI god. Others insist it's a disease, an invisible infection that takes people in their sleep. A small group of engineers, descendants of those who once controlled the ship, believe something far worse is happening. They break into the sealed control room and force the AI to reveal the ship's records. What they discover is worse than anything they imagined. There are things moving within the ship, creatures that should not exist. The AI has been tracking them for years, silently watching as they multiply, as they evolve. And now, it may be too late to stop them. The ship continues its slow crawl through the void. But inside, civilization is falling apart. The few who understand what's happening must decide. Do they try to fight back against something they barely comprehend? Do they attempt to communicate with the unknown entities lurking in the ship's depths? Or do they abandon all hope and seek refuge in the cold, airless void of space itself? The true horror of a generation ship is not just its isolation. It's the realization that, in the endless blackness of space, no one is coming to save you. The air in the corridors of Erebus had grown stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that no one could quite place. At first, The engineers chalked it up to minor issues with the ship's filtration system, a problem easily fixed. But soon, the whispers began. People spoke of strange sounds echoing through the vents at night, skittering noises, heavy breathing, and, on occasion, something that almost sounded like speech. The elders dismissed these rumors as the paranoia of a population long removed from open skies and fresh air. But then, the disappearances escalated. At first, it was the outliers, the maintenance workers who ventured into the darkened ducts to check the failing climate control systems. Their absence was explainable. They had become lost, trapped, or perhaps injured in the labyrinthine network of tunnels that ran through the ship's infrastructure. But when entire families began to vanish from their living quarters, doors locked from the inside, food still warm on the table, the people of Erebus knew something was terribly wrong. The Erebus was never meant to be a mystery. Designed to be self-sustaining, its layout followed the principles of efficiency: living quarters stacked in modular towers, hydroponic farms humming with controlled growth, and engineering sections humming with life support machinery. But the vents, the maintenance tunnels that ran through every level of the ship, were different. They were never meant for human habitation. They were tight, winding, and dangerously claustrophobic. And yet, something was in there. Something was moving. One of the last recorded maintenance logs from a missing worker had been salvaged from his communicator. Discovered abandoned near an open air duct. The final entry was chilling. I don't know what I saw. I thought it was another tech, but it wasn't. Too tall, too thin, eyes reflected light. It didn't walk, it scurried. And then it just vanished. God help me, I think it smiled. These were not the panicked words of an inexperienced novice. The worker had been with the engineering crew for over a decade. He had no reason to fabricate such a claim. And yet, despite the growing evidence, the ruling council refused to acknowledge the possibility of an unknown presence aboard the ship. Until it was too late. A patrol team, armed with salvaged weapons from the old security caches, was finally sent into the vent systems to investigate. The recordings from their helmet cams would later be recovered, though the bodies were never found. The footage showed narrow, winding corridors of rusting metal, walls scratched with patterns that looked almost deliberate. Then, movement, a blur of dark limbs, elongated fingers dragging across the grates, a sudden shriek, inhuman, echoing through the metal, then static. The footage ended with one final frame, a single, milky white eye staring directly into the lens, unblinking. The vents were no longer just a pathway for air. They had become something else, a hunting ground. The few who dared to theorize about the nature of the entities stalking the ship proposed terrifying possibilities. Some believed they were the remnants of a failed genetic experiment, perhaps an attempt to engineer human adaptability to space that had gone terribly wrong. Others whispered of an external threat, something that had entered the ship unnoticed, hidden in the microscopic void of space, growing and evolving over generations until it became something else entirely. Whatever they were intelligent. They understood the ship's layout. They knew how to avoid detection. And they were learning. Patterns emerged. The disappearances followed a cycle, targeting specific areas before moving on, never lingering too long in one place. It was almost as if they were testing the humans, studying their reactions, probing their weaknesses. Panic set in. People stopped sleeping. Families barricaded themselves in their quarters, sealing vents with whatever scrap metal they could find. The council, unable to maintain order, fractured into factions, some believing in negotiation, others in outright extermination. Riots broke out, and in the chaos, more people disappeared. A group of rogue engineers decided that waiting was no longer an option. They sealed off sections of the ship, cutting power to entire wings in an effort to starve out whatever lurked within the infrastructure. But the creatures were prepared. They anticipated the move, and when the engineers returned to check on their progress, they found that the vents in the newly sealed areas had been torn open from the inside. Whatever was in there, it wasn't trapped with them. They were trapped with it. The ship's distress signal, sent out as a last-ditch effort, would take centuries to reach the nearest human settlement. By the time it was received, Erebus would either be long abandoned or something far worse. The final recorded message from a survivor was simple, spoken in a hushed, shaking voice. They don't just live in the vents anymore. They've learned how to open doors. Then silence. The generation ship Erebus drifted on through the endless dark, its fate unknown. But one thing was certain. Whatever had been waiting in the vents was waiting no longer. It was coming. Life aboard Erebus was once structured, even predictable. The ship followed strict cycles to simulate days and nights. Artificial light dimming and brightening at designated intervals. Hydroponic farms provided food, though resources were rationed more tightly with each passing decade. Jobs were assigned from birth, ensuring the ship functioned as efficiently as possible. But with each unexplained disappearance, routine turned to fear. The once orderly schedule became erratic as fewer workers reported to their shifts. Tasks once taken for granted, securing water, maintaining air circulation, now carried an element of dread. People began avoiding the halls near the vents, taking longer, indirect routes to their destinations despite the risk of punishment for inefficiency. Conversations became hushed, filled with nervous glances toward unseen corners. Even the sound of an air vent activating could send shivers down a person's spine. Children were no longer allowed to wander the corridors alone. Families huddled together at night, covering air grates in their quarters with whatever they could find, metal scraps, furniture, even layers of clothing in a desperate attempt to block whatever might be watching from the other side. The ship's engineers and security personnel, under increasing pressure from the council, formed investigation teams to explore the vent system. Armed with makeshift weapons, metal rods, repurposed cutting tools, they ventured into the maze of tunnels snaking through the ship's walls. They documented signs of movement, scratches along the metal, strange residue clinging to grates, and, most disturbingly, missing sections of ventilation panels, as though something had torn through them from the inside. One team managed to capture an audio recording. Heavy breathing, a skittering sound, a deep, guttural clicking noise, rhythmic and deliberate, then a voice, distorted, mechanical, and yet unmistakably human, whispering a single word, "Leave." Despite these findings, the council hesitated to act, fearing mass hysteria. Some still clung to rational explanations, structural failures, hallucinations caused by prolonged isolation. But those who ventured into the vents knew better. They had seen the shadows moving where no light should reach. They had felt the unnatural stillness that came before the whispers. Fear turned to paranoia. Accusations spread like wildfire. Some believed the disappearances were not the work of creatures but of humans, rogue groups kidnapping others for their own unknown purposes. Neighbors began to distrust one another, families accusing each other of conspiring with the unseen force. The council struggled to maintain control, issuing curfews and restrictions, but the people had lost faith in their leadership. Riots broke out in the lower sectors. Food stores were looted. A group of dissenters attempted to seize control of the ship's central command, only to be met with violent suppression. In the chaos, several more people vanished, taken not by rebellion or starvation, but by whatever lurked in the vents. The decision was made to send a final investigative team into the vents, this time fully armed. 5 crew members, each equipped with repurposed welding torches and makeshift spears, crawled into the tunnels, guided by the last known coordinates of the missing maintenance workers. The vents were tight, oppressive, filled with the scent of rust and something else, something organic. One by one, their radio signals flickered out. Panicked breathing filled the last transmission, followed by a sudden, sharp scream, then silence. The only survivor, a young engineer named Callum, emerged hours later, covered in grime and shaking uncontrollably. His left arm was missing from the elbow down, crudely wrapped in torn fabric. He spoke in a frantic whisper, his voice raw from screaming. It wasn't human. It had arms, but too many. Eyes, but not where they should be. It moved like liquid, bending where there were no joints. It watched us. It studied us. We were never meant to find it. The council attempted to suppress his account, branding him delusional. But those who had already seen the shadows in the vents knew the truth. It was no longer just taking people. It was hunting them. With the ship descending into anarchy, the last remaining rational minds among the crew debated drastic measures. Should they vent the tunnels into space, sacrificing critical infrastructure in hopes of purging the entity? Could they isolate and trap it, assuming it even obeyed the laws of physics? Or was the only option to abandon the ship entirely, boarding escape pods destined for an uncertain fate? Before they could act, The ship's emergency lights flickered, then died. The vents hissed open, and the nightmare truly began. The final recorded message from a survivor, intercepted from an emergency communication channel, was simple, spoken in a hushed, shaking voice. They don't just live in the vents anymore. They've learned how to open doors. Then silence. The generation ship Erebus drifted on through the endless dark, its fate unknown. But one thing was certain. Whatever had been waiting in the vents was waiting no longer. It was coming. The implications of this discovery were far-reaching. The creature was intelligent, adaptive, and worst of all, patient. It had learned to navigate the ship, to avoid detection, and now, to infiltrate living quarters. The idea of a safe space no longer existed aboard Erebus. People began abandoning their posts entirely. The ship's vital systems were neglected. Lights flickered erratically, oxygen levels fluctuated, and hydroponic farms withered from lack of maintenance. Panic replaced order, and soon, it wasn't just the entity claiming lives. Starvation, oxygen deprivation, and violence spread like an unstoppable virus. In the void of space, there was nowhere to run. No planets, no rescue, no second chances. The entity knew this. It waited for the moment when fear would override logic, when chaos would do its work for it. Erebus was not its hunting ground. It was its nest. The final recorded message from a survivor, intercepted from an emergency communication channel, was simple, spoken in a hushed, shaking voice. They don't just live in the vents anymore. They've learned how to open doors. Then silence. The generation ship Erebus drifted on through the endless dark, its fate unknown. But one thing was certain. Whatever had been waiting in the vents was waiting no longer. It was coming. What do you believe really happened aboard Erebus? Share your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our previous videos about life in space for more terrifying insights.